The new teacher, Emily. The carriage rattled down the cobblestone path, its wheels churning up clouds of dust that hung lazily in the late afternoon air. Emily Grayson peered out of the window, her eyes tracing the dense canopy of trees that bordered the narrow road. As the village of Hollowbrook emerged from the embrace of the forest, it seemed to her like a place forgotten by time, its crooked houses huddled together as if in secret conference. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Emily inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the city's smog lift from her lungs. Her new beginning as a schoolteacher in this secluded village felt like a step into another world, one shrouded in an almost tangible mystery. As the carriage clattered to a halt, she stepped out onto the uneven cobbles. The villagers eyed her with a curiosity that bordered on suspicion, their gazes flickering away when she attempted to meet them. Their faces were etched with lines of hardship, and their eyes held stories untold, secrets deeply buried. The village inn, the Raven's Rest, stood crookedly at the village's heart, its timbers warped by time. The innkeeper, a stooped figure with wary eyes, greeted her with a nod more curt than cordial. His hands were gnarled like the branches of the ancient trees outside, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the rasp of many winters. "You'll be the new teacher, then?" he asked, eyeing her leather trunk and the books it bulged with. "Yes, I am," Emily replied, her voice steady yet imbued with an unspoken question. The innkeeper merely grunted, turning to lead her to her room. As Emily followed, she felt the weight of the village's gaze upon her, as heavy and real as the evening mist beginning to creep from the forest that circled Hollowbrook like a dark, whispering shroud. "Hey, quick reminder, don't forget to subscribe and like for more videos." The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows on the cobblestone streets of Hollowbrook. Emily Grayson stood at the threshold of the quaint, ivy-covered schoolhouse, her heart aflutter with the anticipation of her first day. The children, dressed in simple, homespun clothes, eyed her with a blend of curiosity and reserve as they filed into the classroom. As she began her lessons, Emily found the children to be bright but strangely subdued, their laughter and chatter muted, as if restrained by an unseen force. During a reading lesson, a small boy named Thomas hesitated over a passage, his voice trailing off into silence. Emily noticed his gaze drifting towards the window, his eyes wide and fearful. "What is it, Thomas?" she asked gently, kneeling beside his desk. Thomas glanced around, his voice a mere whisper. "It's the Whisperer, Miss Grayson," he murmured. "He comes at night whispering things." Emily felt a chill run down her spine, despite the warmth of the sun streaming through the windows. She noticed the other children nodding solemnly, their eyes filled with a knowing fear. "Who is the Whisperer?" Emily pressed, her curiosity piqued. But the children fell silent, their eyes darting towards each other, a silent pact of secrecy binding their tongues. The bell rang for recess, and they scurried out, leaving Emily alone with a gnawing sense of unease. Later, while strolling through the village, Emily decided to broach the subject with the local grocer, a rotund, jovial man named Mr. Higgins. At the mention of the Whisperer, his smile faltered, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting an unwanted eavesdropper. "Just old tales, Miss Grayson," he said quickly, a little too brightly. "Village children have vivid imaginations, you know." But the way he avoided her gaze told Emily there was more to the story. As she walked back to the inn, the shadows seemed to stretch longer and darker across her path, and the rustling of the trees sounded almost like hushed voices, whispering secrets just beyond her understanding. The morning sun filtered weakly through the dense canopy, casting a fragmented light on the worn path leading to the village library. Emily, wrapped in a cloak against the crisp air, felt a shiver that wasn't entirely from the cold. Today, she delved into Hollowbrook's history, seeking whispers of truth among the cobwebs of the past. The library was a quaint, ivy-clad building, its wooden doors groaning in protest as she pushed them open. Inside, the air was thick with the musty scent of old books and forgotten tales. Dust motes danced in the slanted beams of light, and the silence was so profound it felt like another presence in the room. Mr. Alcott, the elderly librarian with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, greeted her with a cautious smile. "Looking for something particular?" he inquired, his voice a delicate whisper, as though afraid to disturb the slumbering books. "I'm interested in the history of Hollowbrook, especially any local legends," Emily replied, her voice trailing off as she noticed Mr. Alcott's sudden stiffness. "Ah, the legends," he murmured, leading her to a secluded corner where the older records lay. His fingers, trembling slightly, brushed over the spines of the books, each a keeper of secrets. As Emily thumbed through the yellowed pages, she uncovered tales of hardship, of settlers grappling with the untamed land. But intertwined with these accounts were darker threads, stories of disappearances, unexplained shadows in the woods, and an omnipresent whisper that seemed to echo through the centuries. One account, dated over 100 years ago, spoke of a whispering entity, a specter that haunted the village, its origins as mysterious as its motives. The handwriting trembled as the author recounted nights filled with unsettling murmurs and figures seen in the corner of the eye, just beyond the grasp of reality. Emily's heart quickened. Here in these brittle pages lay the genesis of the Whisperer. As she read on, the library's silence grew heavier, almost expectant, as if the very walls were leaning in to hear her reaction to the ghostly tales cradled within their shelter. Night had draped Hollowbrook in a cloak of silence, broken only by the occasional creak of ancient timber. Emily lay awake in her bed at the Raven's Rest, staring into the darkness that pooled in the corners of her room. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and a faint, inexplicable hint of damp earth, as if the forest itself was seeping into the walls. She had grown accustomed to the nocturnal symphony of the village, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But tonight, something was different. There was a stillness in the air, a tension that made her skin prickle. Emily's thoughts wandered to the day's events, the veiled warnings from the villagers, their eyes darting away when she mentioned the Whisperer. Then it began, the faintest whisper, like the rustling of dry leaves. At first, Emily thought it was her imagination, the product of too many whispered tales. But the sound persisted, growing in clarity, a susurrus of unintelligible syllables that seemed to emanate from the very walls of her room. Fighting a surge of fear, Emily sat up, her eyes straining in the darkness. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. She reached for the matches on her bedside table, her fingers trembling. The flame of the match cast a quivering glow, throwing grotesque shapes against the walls. But there was nothing. No source for the eerie whispers that now seemed to encircle her. The whispers crescendoed, a chorus of ethereal voices that filled the room. Emily's heart raced, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She wanted to call out, to break the spell of these disembodied voices, but fear held her voice captive. As suddenly as it had started, the whispering ceased. The oppressive silence returned, leaving Emily shivering in the flickering candlelight. She knew then that the stories were more than mere superstitions. Something ancient and unseen lurked in the shadows of Hollowbrook, and it had turned its gaze upon her. The night air was thick with a fog that seemed to swallow the moonlight, leaving the village of Hollowbrook cloaked in an impenetrable gloom. Emily Grayson, with only a flickering lantern in her hand, made her way cautiously towards the edge of the forest. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. Since her arrival, Emily had heard the tales, felt the prickling of unseen eyes upon her. And tonight, she was determined to confront whatever truth lay hidden in these woods. Each step seemed to echo unnaturally in the still air, and the damp earth beneath her feet whispered with her every movement. As she ventured deeper, the forest seemed to close in around her, the gnarled branches intertwining overhead, blotting out the scarce light of the stars. A sense of unease began to coil in her stomach, but she pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and fascination. Suddenly a chill breeze stirred the air, and with it came a whisper, soft, yet unmistakably clear. "Emily?" The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a spectral breath that made her heart stutter. Her hand trembled, and the lantern's light quivered, casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. She stopped, her breath coming in short gasps, as the whispering intensified, swirling around her in a malevolent chorus. The lantern slipped from her grasp, shattering against the ground and plunging her into darkness. In the blackness, her other senses heightened, the scent of decay, the cold touch of mist, and the ever-present whispers that seemed to echo her deepest fears. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was shapeless, yet unmistakably sentient. A darker patch of night that moved with purpose. Emily could feel its gaze upon her, a pressure that was almost physical. Her heart raced, and for a moment she was rooted to the spot, her rational mind struggling to comprehend the impossibility before her. The Whisperer, as real as the fear that choked her. The night was moonless, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow everything, even sound. Emily sat at her desk, the candlelight casting long, flickering shadows across the room. She was surrounded by piles of old journals and dusty records she had gathered from the village archives. Each page whispered secrets of the past, and amongst these whispers, she searched for the truth about the whisperer. A cold gust of wind rattled the window, making her shiver. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her eyes never leaving the ancient text in front of her. It was a diary, belonging to a villager who had lived over a century ago. The pages were yellowed and fragile. The ink faded, but the words were clear enough to send a chill down her spine. "The whisperer comes on nights like these," the diary read, "when the darkness is so thick you can feel it in your bones. It feeds on our fears, our regrets." Emily's hand trembled as she turned the page. The diary detailed a tragic event, a fire that had consumed part of the village many years ago, taking several lives with it. The author of the diary believed this event had given birth to the Whisperer, a manifestation of the village's collective grief and guilt. As she read on, the wind outside grew louder, howling like a creature in pain. The candle flickered, casting grotesque shapes on the walls. Emily felt a sense of foreboding, as if the diary had awoken something that lay dormant in the shadows of her room. Closing the book, she realized that the key to confronting the Whisperer lay in understanding this tragedy. The entity was not just a specter haunting the woods, but a scar in the very soul of Hollowbrook, a scar that had never healed. Determined, Emily knew what she had to do. The Whisperer was born of sorrow and loss, and only by facing these truths could the village find peace. She blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, and for a moment, she thought she heard a faint whisper in the wind, a sigh from the past, beckoning her to unearth its secrets. The night was moonless, the sky a heavy blanket of black, as if the stars themselves dared not witness what was to come. Emily stood at the edge of the village, where the cobblestones gave way to the wild embrace of the forest. Her heart was a drumbeat in her chest, echoing the restless rustling of the trees. Tonight, she would confront the Whisperer. Armed with the knowledge unearthed from the depths of Hollowbrook's tragic past, she felt a resolve stealing her nerves. The air was thick with anticipation, and a cold breeze whispered through the leaves, carrying with it a sense of imminent dread. As she stepped into the forest, the darkness seemed to swell around her, swallowing the weak light from her lantern. The path ahead was a labyrinth of shadows, each twist and turn leading deeper into the heart of her fears. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. Then a whisper, faint as a dying breath, brushed against her ear. Emily's blood turned to ice. She spun around, lantern held high, but saw nothing except the dense thicket of trees. The whispers grew, a chorus of disembodied voices swirling around her, each one dripping with malice. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, as if the very night were closing in on her. Summoning all her courage, Emily called out to the Whisperer, her voice a defiant beacon in the oppressive gloom. For a moment there was silence. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, its form nebulous and shifting, a specter of despair and rage born from the village's long-forgotten sins. Emily faced the entity, her heart pounding in her ears. The Whisperer loomed before her, its presence a suffocating weight. She knew this was the moment of truth, the culmination of all her fears and determination. With the secrets of the past as her shield, Emily prepared to confront the nightmare that had haunted Hollowbrook for generations. The night was a tapestry of shadows and silences as Emily stood at the edge of the village, her heart drumming a rapid rhythm of anticipation and fear. The moon was a thin crescent, barely shedding light on the path that led into the heart of the whispering forest. Every sense was heightened, every rustle of the leaves a language she strained to understand. She stepped forward, her boots sinking softly into the damp earth. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like fingers stretching towards her. A chill breeze brushed her face, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. Emily paused, listening. The whisper grew clearer, a symphony of sorrowful voices entwined with a cold, malicious undertone that made her shiver. As she ventured deeper, the forest seemed to close around her, the air thick with an ancient earthy scent. Then, in a clearing bathed in the pale moonlight, she saw it, the Whisperer. It was an ethereal figure, its form shifting and wavering like smoke. Its eyes, dark voids in its ghostly face, locked onto hers. Emily felt the air grow heavy, the whispers crescendoing into a cacophony that filled her head. She wanted to flee, but her feet were rooted to the spot. The Whisperer moved closer, and as it did, Emily's mind flooded with images. Tragic scenes from the village's past, a litany of sorrow and fear that fed the entity before her. But amidst the terror, Emily sensed a profound grief at the core of the Whisperer. It was not just a harbinger of fear, it was a manifestation of the village's collective heartache, a spectral embodiment of unacknowledged tragedies. With this realization, Emily's fear began to ebb, replaced by a surge of empathy. She understood now that the Whisperer was bound here by the unspoken and unresolved pain of generations. Her voice, steady yet soft, broke the night's silence. "I hear you," she whispered. "I see your pain." The Whisperer halted, its swirling form stilling. For a moment the forest was silent, and then, like a sigh of relief, the whispers faded away, leaving Emily alone under the watchful eyes of the ancient trees. The truth of the Whisperer was revealed, not a curse but a cry for acknowledgement and release. As the first light of dawn pierced the dense canopy of Hollowbrook, it found Emily Grayson standing at the edge of the village, her eyes weary but resolute. The night had been long, filled with revelations and confrontations that had forever altered the fabric of the village. The Whisperer, once an unseen terror lurking in the shadows, had revealed its true nature. A manifestation of the village's collective grief and unspoken guilt, born from a tragedy long buried in its past. The spectral entity, with its chilling whispers and ethereal presence, was not just a spirit but a symbol of unhealed wounds. Emily's confrontation with the Whisperer had been less a battle and more a catharsis. In the heart of the forest, under the watchful eyes of ancient trees, she had faced the entity. Words of understanding had passed her lips, not spells or curses, but a recognition of the pain and loss that had given birth to this ghostly sentinel. The villagers who had joined her in the forest witnessed this revelation. Together they had stood, a community bound by a shared history, finally confronting the ghost of their collective past. It was a moment of raw emotional power, a mingling of sorrow, forgiveness, and a tentative hope. Now, as Emily watched the village awaken, she felt a shift in the air. The oppressive atmosphere of fear that had once shrouded Hollowbrook seemed to lift, giving way to a cautious sense of peace. The villagers emerged from their homes, their eyes meeting hers not with the old wariness but with a dawning understanding and gratitude. The Whisperer was no longer a name spoken in fear. It had become a part of the village's story, a tragic chapter that was now acknowledged and remembered. Emily knew her role in Hollowbrook was not yet over. There was healing to be done, wounds to mend, but the first light of dawn promised a new beginning, a chance to rebuild not just the village but the hearts of those who called it home. The dawn broke over Hollowbrook with a hesitant light, as if the sun itself was wary of what it might find in the village's wake. Emily stood at the threshold of the inn, her eyes reflecting the pale gold of the rising sun. The night's events lingered in her mind like the remnants of a fever dream, both vivid and surreal. The confrontation with the Whisperer had been unlike anything she could have imagined. In those fleeting moments, where the boundary between the living and the spectral had blurred, Emily had seen not just a specter of fear, but a manifestation of the village's collective sorrow and guilt. It was as if the Whisperer was both a warden and a prisoner of their unspoken regrets. As she walked through the silent streets, she noticed the change in the air. The suffocating aura of dread that once hung over the village, like a pall, had lifted, replaced by a somber, reflective quiet. The villagers, emerging from their homes, no longer averted their gazes but met hers with a mixture of gratitude and newfound respect. The schoolhouse, once a place of hushed voices and furtive glances, now resonated with the sound of children's laughter. Emily's heart swelled as she watched her students play, free from the invisible chains of fear that had once bound them. She knew the memory of the Whisperer would linger, but like the shadows at dawn, it would no longer hold power over them. As the day waned, Emily returned to the edge of the forest, the site of her encounter. The trees stood silent, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. She realized Hollowbrook would always be a place of mysteries. Some whispered in the light, others murmured in the shadows. But it was no longer a place of fear. In the twilight, Emily thought she heard a whisper, a sigh of release from the very soul of the village. It was a sound both sad and hopeful, like the end of a long night. She smiled softly, turning back to the life that awaited her in Hollowbrook, a place no longer unknown but a home. We have come to the end of our story. Subscribe and like the video so as not to miss the videos that we will upload in the future. Tell me, what do you think about this story in the comments? I'll see you in the next story.